music and want to make any music around here, we'd love to have you do that as well. We met earlier. I think I'm Doug if we haven't formally met. And I've been leading the sermons. Our sermons have had a theme around here the last 4 weeks. We're not sure what the next 4 are going to entail. These 4 have been origin story, Genesis, about us, creation narratives, this sort of thing. The idea being that all of us find ourselves in multiple places and multiple time frames in our lives. Every new beginning is, part of some other piece of our lives. We can all sort of mark ourselves where something changed, a relationship, a job, a perspective, a place you were living. It's a big deal. And I wanted to talk a little bit in these sermons about Jesus as the founder of Christianity and what that means for all of us, because Christianity has an idea that Jesus tried to unveil, call people into it. So a couple of just recaps from the last couple of weeks. I want to suggest that Jesus is a master spiritual teacher, and we should learn how to follow the teachings of Jesus like you would a master spiritual teacher. A lot of people have a category for Jesus that's far more religious than Jesus as a spiritual teacher. Part of what's actually helped me kind of reconnect with Jesus as a spiritual teacher was reading the writings and listening to the writings of a Buddhist teacher named Thich Nhat Hanh. I realized in myself the way I was listening to Thich Nhat Hanh, reading his writings and paying attention to what he was saying, felt different to me than the way I was listening to the teachings of Jesus. And I found that to be curious, why I was doing that. I have a master's degree in that stuff, but it's just pretty easy to kind of lose yourself sometimes. And the teachings of Jesus haven't become part of the dogma of a church or the history of your faith or scripture in some way. So anyway, I think the gospel writers really wanted us to see Jesus as a spiritual teacher and is presented that way. And that Jesus has a call for a new way of human life. Jesus is, as we're talking about before the gathering, sort of the original full-on humanist. We're going to get to that tonight with the passages that we asked Susie to read. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Jesus taking these phrases that were used for Torah. You might know that the first 5 books of the Bible are called the Torah in Jewish faith. So for Jesus, he was taught the Torah. And the word Torah comes from the word light, torch. The Torah was referred to as the light of the world. So when Jesus says to people, you're the light of the world, what he's doing is he's playing on that. He's playing on you are the voice of God, you are the inspiration. So he's calling humanity into that way of life. Same with the salt of the earth. It was the healing balm. Where else would I go from your word, O Lord? The prophets and the psalmists tell us to find healing. And then Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth. So don't lose that saltiness. Don't not be what we have said that the word of God is. Be that in your life, or then it's just useless and sits away. So anyway, Jesus is this call for humanity to live in this really lively and revolutionary way. And sometimes that has its emphasis in the collective society, and sometimes it has its emphasis in each and every one of us. And to a spiritual teacher like Jesus, like all the other great spiritual teachers, there's no distinguishing that which is true for the one and that which is true for the all. They become marbled into one another and deeply connected. And then Jesus as the Son of God is presented that way to be presented as the brother of humanity. He wants to live out this brother of humanity way. So I think Jesus had this impulse, this call, this way of life that I think has a way of life for a lot of us. And then a couple weeks ago I talked about what I see as sort of the structure of Jesus' teaching, love of yourself, love of your neighbor, love of your enemy, love of God, all part of the whole. They go together. I want to do a little bit on the role tonight, the role of regret and pain in this process, and this idea of Jesus saying that there's a way of humanity that we can all live in and find, and that needs to incorporate, is best if it incorporates, or possibly better to say it could incorporate, sadness, missing, and regret. Some of you know that Grace and Luke Bredesen and their kids, Josiah and Sophia and Izzy. And Grace wrote this on Facebook yesterday at 9:49, so it's public enough for us here. She writes, Izzy, or the daughter, to Luke, her husband, I don't understand why Grandma died when we're praying a lot for her to get better. And then Grace says, I wonder the same thing. How do you not lose your faith And how do you help your children keep their faith in times like this? And then people were very kind and wrote really helpful things. And then Grace goes on to say in a comment, it's hard because my girls prayed the same thing every night for 3 months, that God would heal their grandmother, Grace's mom. I'm afraid now that they're going to think that prayer doesn't work, that God doesn't listen, or that God isn't there. And that's how I felt when my grandmother died 6 years ago, and I only recently began to get my faith back. I don't want my kids to think God isn't there, that God doesn't listen, and that prayer is pointless. I don't know how to navigate this with them. That's one way to say it, right? Pretty points. I think we all get it. I think every one of us would have some version of that, be it about God, or be it about your own life, or be it about your family you grew up in, or the work that you're in. Like, the role of regret in loving God, yourself, your neighbor, and others is so profound and so deep. And I think that's some of what Jesus is getting at with this, you're the salt of the earth. Don't lose your saltiness. Don't let it be driven away. If you think the only way you're going to maintain any kind of saltiness of life, usefulness in life, balm of healing, because salt does all this stuff, and there's a whole book on this that you should read sometime, like the history of salt. Is that what it's called? People read this book about salt? Mm-hmm. Oh, it's super great. And there's like this cooking show that's like, what's the cooking show about?
Salt, acid.
Yes. Yeah, okay, you guys all know stuff already. Classic church moment. You already know it. Somebody says it anyway. But there's this whole thing about the power of salt. You can cook with salt and preserve with salt and break down with salt and all this kind of stuff, right? Jesus was fully into that because much of the kind of cooking that his community would have known at the day used a lot of salt. It was a powerful part of life and all. So it was this kind of function of saltiness that was a good thing. Now we refer to people as salty. Can sort of mean they're sort of crabby. But anyway, don't lose that. There's a tendency to suggest that, internally to a lot of us, that sadness and regret, the breakdown, failure, yours, other people's, is actually contrary to this kind of faith that you want to hold. Or, as Jesus said, you're the light of the world. Don't hide it under a bowl. Let it shine so that other people can be part of the family. How do you let that light shine? You'll notice as you go around on that side of the street out there, and then over on the end of our sidewalk, on the other side of the alley, there's some stubborn snow. I refer to it as like the stubborn fat that some of us have on our bodies. For me, it's right on my side. Like I literally had hepatitis and got down to like 209 pounds, and I still had fat on my side. It's just not going away, right? Like it's the stubborn part. There's stubborn snow out there, and it can stay really stubborn if it stays out of the light, right? Either stays in the shadow of the south side, or it gets a bunch of dirt over it. It just sits there forever because the sunlight doesn't get to it. You could just spend the rest of your night marveling at the power of light. But Jesus' phrase is not just the physical light, it's also this idea of the Torah. And he wants all of us to have this richness, this fullness, that we can be useful and beneficial to others. That I love this little line. This is actually one of the things that keeps me in the Jesus narrative so deeply. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see the deeds of your life, the good deeds, and glorify your Father in heaven. If you take Jesus as a spiritual teacher, he's suggesting that as humanity, we help each other see God by the deeds of our lives. We are not just meant to only be some diverting reflection. Don't look at me, look over there. There's something in Jesus' call that says, I don't know, when you see the good life, the full life of someone, you're seeing God, the Father, as he would say it in that family model that he's using here. Let your light shine so that others can see your life. Glorify God, Father in heaven. That's pretty, I mean, there can be a lot of pressure to that, right? Like, live a life. Live a good, full, complete life. That's part of what this is about. It's been very common for us in this room. I've said it 1,000 times. You've all said it yourselves, I know, and people have said it in a variety of ways here, that the call of the Christian faith, the call of each of us, is not to live in this world like a bunch of people going into a public bathroom where you touch as little as possible and try to get out as soon as you can. It's not how you live in the world. You live in the world not trying to get somewhere else. You live in the world trying to be fully part of it. And being not heaven focused doesn't mean not being useful to one another focused. It's sort of the point of the whole thing. Just want to make some comments about regret. It's a really powerful thing. There's a book or an album by an artist I like a lot named Jackson Brown, a really famous one back when people wore very high-waisted pants and a t-shirt tucked in. That is a look that I just think could come back. The t-shirt, tucked-in t-shirt, high-waisted pants. It's a good, solid look. Well, there's a song called The Pretender. I'm just going to play you a little clip of it because I like it so much. I can't get it out of my head. And I think it captures an impulse. The album's called The Pretender. The song is about that. And the idea is, will you take on the realities of life or will you just live as the pretender? And he sort of creates this contrast in the song. Jackson Brown is extraordinarily wordy in his song, so this isn't all that long, I promise you, but it's got a piece to it. He says, it opens with this line, he'll sing it in a second when I play the recording, but he says, I want to know what became of the changes that we waited for love to bring. He's hearkening back in his thing to the 60s and the social movements. Like, whatever happened to all that? Were they only fitful dreams of some greater awakening? What do you do with the unresponded to dream? All right, so you can.
I want to know what became of the changes we waited for love to bring. Were they only the fitful dreams of some greater awakening? I've been aware of the time going by. They say in the end it's the wink of an eye. When the morning light comes streaming in, get up and do it again. Caught between the longing for love and the struggle for the legal tender, where the sirens sing and the church bells ring and the junk man pounds his fender, where the veterans dream of the fight, fast asleep at the traffic light, and the children solemnly wait for the ice cream vendor. Out into the cool of the evening strolls the pretender. He knows that all his hopes and dreams begin and end.
Caught between the longing for love and the struggle for the legal tender. What became of the changes that we waited for that love to bring? Were they only the fitful dreams of some greater awakening? These are the impulses of someone who gets the idea that it doesn't break your way hardly ever. You're called to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And it's riddled with regret and with pain and with shortcoming. And then there's moments of beauty and grace. And if time was the indicator of the power, life would be really miserable. Because most of us live in between moments of grace and true love and acceptance of ourselves and others and God and enemy. Those are really small, but they carry a lot of power. They don't carry a lot of time. Most of us are struggling between the longing for love and the struggle for the legal tender. How do we get along? Where the sirens sing, panic, and church bells are ringing, and all these choices we have to make and what we're going to do with our lives. And I think the impulse is in this song. I think the impulse is in Jesus. I think the impulse in all of us is, how do you live a life when it's going to be met with failure, regret, and not breaking your way? The prayer doesn't get answered. The relationship doesn't go the way you want. The funding doesn't come through. The people don't show up. That's most of the time, right? I don't know. I think it's most of the time for most of us. I'm going to play you a little video clip from a movie that I like a lot. I've played it before. You might know. It's from a movie called The Big Kahuna. It's a story of one person at 3 stages of life. It all happens in a room together. It's a real wordy kind of film. In this particular scene, this guy is the younger version. The person you're going to see is Danny DeVito. He's the older version. And then there's another character, it's the middle version. And in this older person is talking to the younger person, and it's meant to be seen as a person talking to themselves at 3 stages of life. You've probably done this or thought about this. Like if you could say something to yourself when you were 15, when you were 9, when you were 22, what would you say to yourself? A lot of people end up motivating their lives because they want to leave something different in the world than what they heard other people saying to them. So that's this real common practice. And in this particular scene, this younger person here is really struggling because he's sort of a purist about all things and thinks that the middle-aged character is a totally complete sellout, and the older one gives him this little soliloquy, the younger one's Danny DeVito, about regret. And so anyway, it goes like this. It's supposed to.
We were talking before about character. You were asking me about character. And we were speaking of faces. But the question is much deeper than that. The question is, do you have any character at all? And if you want my honest opinion, Bob, you do not. For the simple reason that you don't regret anything yet.
You're saying I won't have any character? Unless I do something I regret?
No, Bob. I'm saying you've already done plenty of things to regret. You just don't know what they are. It's when you discover them. When you see the folly in something you've done, and you wish that you had it to do over. But you know you can't, because it's too late. So you pick that thing up and you carry it with you to remind you that life goes on. The world will spin without you. You really don't matter in the end. Then you will attain character. Because honesty will reach out from inside and tattoo itself all across your face. Until that day, however, you cannot expect to go beyond a certain point.
May I go now?
Go ahead.
Thank you.
It's worth watching the whole thing to see what leads to this point. But this idea, we've all done things we regret. We've all lived with regrets. Things haven't gone. At some point, the honesty of that is what comes out. I think this is the thing Jesus is getting at. I'm not trying to be Jesus' apologist. I just think he was getting at something much deeper. Be the light of the world. Don't hide it. Be the salt of the earth. Don't let it just become trampled and worthless. Let all those realities, all those things, all of that, the good and the bad and the difficult and the fair, all of it to be incorporated and all of it to be shared and all of it to be embraced. And then something starts to happen where the truth shines, where the healing comes, where the usefulness is there. This is what's called maturity, spiritual growth, spiritual life. This is what the great people, this is what we all long to when we see somebody that we think has sort of found some truth and has something. And the thing is, time itself won't necessarily do that. It's these deep recognitions of this. So I think there's something really powerful in these narratives of you're the salt of the earth, you're the light of the world. I think it has to do with this whole agenda and this whole beginnings and what we do with them in our own lives, the project where any of us are living, and where we all find ourselves. Most of us in here are in the middle to the middle end of what we call our lives. It's a real question. How do we engage Sorry, let's take a couple of minutes for some interaction. Maybe you have some thoughts about this. We'll keep this one open to the whole group. So thoughts, comments, questions, feedbacks, things you're thinking about. I don't know, it can sort of, unloading a heavy topic that someone thought about, picked out a song and edited it and then put a movie clip, And you're like, I don't know, I was thinking, but anyway, just share with me. It's the downfall to this style of presentation. People like smart. Yes, Michelle?
Yeah, I'll say something.
Please.
I was actually just thinking of that exact story on the way over here when I was driving. I thought, don't put your light under a basket. I was saying basket in my head, but and I think like there's just a ton of value in that because I have this sort of Catholic, out of breath, I think I'm nervous, but narrative of like be humble and don't say too much, don't ask for help, and that there's kind of like under a basket kind of thing, like do lots of good works, but don't shine. And I was like, screw that today. I was like, no, like it's okay to like have wonder and joy and be like, I'm gonna throw it out there and I'm gonna dance and I'm gonna like, I don't know, like that's I brought some joy to a friend today and it like did wonders for her. And I was like, oh, that's cool. Like let's bring out some light.
Yeah. And everything doesn't have to go your way to be the person that brings out some light, right? You don't. Well, there's this pattern that a lot of us can down talk ourselves. Well, everything's not great, so I want to. You know what I'm getting at? Like I don't want to overplay because there's these struggles and all. The thing that goes on internally in a lot of us that sort of tamps down the salt underfoot or keeps the light dim.
Oh yeah.
It's a real thing.
With the climate crisis, like I was just like holding that pain in that group and then not able to see the joy and the wonder.
Yes.
And a wise person was like, that's gonna kill you.
It's going to kill you.
Like literally it's gonna kill you. And I was like, oh.
One of the things I love about that phrase in that movie is he says, you do things you regret and then you pick it up and you carry it with you. You don't live in it, you bring it along. You don't leave it, you don't become the pretender. This is a great Jackson Browne, I think, beautiful little thing. Like you can either stroll out on the street as the pretender or you can take that stuff seriously and deal with that loss and deal with it. It's not the way you want it to be and deal with your own failures, society's failures, the government's failures, Robert Mueller's failures, your dad's failures, like however you get there, right? However that lands on you, what do you do with that? And how do you let that light shine? This is the grittiness of real life. It's so easy to take Jesus as, you're the light of the world, you're the salt of the earth, as sort of some, carnival barker. I don't think he is, and I don't think he's also doing some religion. I think he's saying, this is what life is. This is how it flows. Yeah, you guys?
I think the good deeds thing I've always heard in my world and my upbringing as like the good things you do. And when I'm reading it here, I'm thinking not the good things I do, but maybe my passions, the things that are alive in me, my talents, and so not like only that I I don't know, served something, but that I'm good at this thing or I'm good at that thing, and that's the thing I get to share with the rest of us as my passion and my good deed or my thing, and that is a thing that glorifies the whole.
Yeah, you're totally tapping in. If we had a lot of time, we'd talk about how the English version of the translation of that word, deeds, that's probably the worst possible version you could get to. The fullness of your life is probably more like what that probably got at, which is, I think, even more true, right? Like it's not just show off a little some kindness and then people will say, oh, good for God because it was good for you. That's how it gets translated in a transactional form as opposed to an internal form of how it comes from the inside and then tattoos itself on your face and people see it as wisdom. That's sort of what's... there's this great book called The Gift of Going First. It's a book about vulnerability. If you're into this kind, basically it's, hey, give people the gift of going first by telling them about your own vulnerabilities and failures and weaknesses and pain, and that'll open up a floodgate of others' participation in the same thing. That's the kind of idea. All right, anybody else? Anything to, yeah. Carol and then Tessa.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about fear, and Jesus paid, the ultimate price for living in his faith and doing the deeds he wanted to do and that he needed to do, and I think that's a piece of this not without consequences.
Great point, yes. Yeah. Letting that light shine in his world meant hostility and resistance and death and pain. Thank you, Carol. Yeah, Tessa?
I think I just, and I, harkening back to the things you read from Grace, I think the kind of ongoing push to try to get away from having to have things black and white, like the ability to hold God is good and prayer matters,
Yeah.
and sometimes people die.
Yeah.
Somebody pray, and how do you hold light and shining in the midst of darkness
Yeah.
and not deny that either one of those is happening?
Yeah.
And I just think it's such a, there's folks I know who are living it so well. It's a challenge to me because I'm used to it is good where it is bad.
Yes.
And not the ability to have good and bad.
So we go, all right, that's such a good place to end, but do you have one last comment?
Yeah, I'll try and be brief. It's just like, so you're the light of the world makes me think of like you are just meant to give, right? And it's also speaking to me of like redemption. And oddly, while you were talking stuff, I had this vision about how the church always glorifies the cross and the crucifixion, or all this pain that Jesus suffered. And then I think, well, one thing my spirit's learning as I'm getting older is actually the value of my consequences and the things I've done wrong, as well as like my pain and stuff, because there's purpose to it when you exploit it and you share it,
Well, thank you, Bernie. I don't want to out your story, but if you want to talk to somebody who's figuring out how to do this, sort of letting this come out, Bernie's willing to share a story, and it's rich, and you've been a great example to me for that, so thanks. Hey, we always have at the end of our gatherings some Stations Prayer. Carlos can give you some instructions about that. We'll do these for a couple of minutes. This conversation might take you to one of those places. Something else might take you to one of those places, but this is our prayer response. Do you want to use the mic or not?
Sure. Should. Victoria's Craft